Hello, everybody. I hope you all doing well. This is the Progressive American. It's been a while since we've done a live stream. I'm sitting here with Ira Shapiro, an expert on the Senate, a former staffer for Clinton and for the United States Senate, multiple senators, too many to list off, and the author of The Betrayal: How Mitch McConnell and the Senate Republicans Abandoned America. Thank you very much for joining me, Ira.
Connor, it's great to be with you. Thanks for the opportunity.
My pleasure. So, a lot of the discussion and a lot of what we talk about in politics has unfortunately had a very president centric point of view. And one of the things you've emphasized through your extensive career, both as a writer on the Senate, but as also a person who participated in it as a staffer, is there is more to the story. And I was wondering if you could get into not only the importance of the Senate as a matter of fixing much of our partisan problems today, but also as a mediating factor on the most extreme elements of our body politic.
Well, Connor, I'm afraid that I've probably spent more time thinking about the Senate than any reasonable person should. Uh, it was not my intention when I started out as a Senate intern more than a half century ago that I would be spending so much time on it. But it turns out that the Senate is quite important. I mean, obviously, in our system, every part of the system has to work for the government to work. But the Senate's unique role, as you suggested, is the mediating function. Walter Mondale once called the Senate the nation's mediator. It's the place where the difficult issues are supposed to be taken on by diverse parties, people from around all over the country through the legislative process and serious legislating, negotiating, and principled compromise. And at its best, that's the way the Senate works. Unfortunately, there's been a long decline in the Senate. It's too often the case that people can't think of anything before Donald Trump got on the scene. But I think the Senate has gone down over a long period of time. I would say 30 years. And the decline has been much steeper, in my estimation, during the McConnell era. And the consequences of that have been severe, most particularly that when we really needed a strong Senate to check a president abusing his powers, we didn't have it. And the Senate failed us catastrophically.
Yeah, and so one of the things that you is been kind of coming up repeatedly, and I've read through portions of your book and some of the material that was has been written about it. And one of the things you've emphasized very, very strongly is that is this idea of compromise that you just mentioned. That this idea that as a matter of the Senate being the anchor of our government, as James Madison called it is supposed to be able to take some of the rawest expressions of the public will and basically focus it down into specifics, being able to communicate with the understanding that the goal is to keep the machine running, not to just destroy the machine or just to slow it down when you don't get your way. And one of the things I distinctly remember in my experience growing up with when it came to hearing about how the Senate was viewed was not in that vein, especially under McConnell's leadership, even before Trump. One of the things you mentioned in your book is how basically McConnell, from the very beginning of the Obama administration, struck the tone of obstruction being the business of the day. And I was wondering, to what extent does that kind of attitude lend credence to the eventual Trump administration? And then also, what does that mean in terms of effective governance? And how do we fix that?
Well, I think that's a great question. And I think it is important, as you've said, that our problems of governance and our political system didn't begin with Donald Trump. There's been, as I said, a long decline, and we could go through the history, but even focusing on the past 15 years, um, McConnell's decision to oppose Barack Obama from day one, notwithstanding the fact that we were on the edge of the Second Great Depression and the country desperately needed economic stimulus and a cooperation in government that McConnell didn't provide. Notwithstanding that, his view of his role as a partisan and an obstructionist was not the traditional way that Senate leaders operated. I grew up, I go back a long way. The audience might suspect that I'm a little old, but the leaders that I knew, they were partisans, but they always had in mind their responsibility to work across the aisle, to work with presidents, even presidents of the other party, and the notion that collective action was supposed to come out of the Senate. So I believe McConnell was a radical departure from Senate leaders like Everett Dirksen, Howard Baker, Robert Dole, and even Trent Lott, who I felt he was too conservative for my taste, but he tried to make the Senate work with Tom Daschle, a Democrat. And this obstruction, and I feel strongly about this point, so I'll emphasize it. There's sometimes a tendency to say, well, it's a partisan time, and McConnell's just been an effective partisan. What do you expect? And the answer is yes, it's a partisan time, but it's a partisan time because he made it a partisan time by passing up every opportunity to work together. Now, to give you the fast forward to 2022, the Senate actually accomplished quite a bit in 2022. McConnell seemingly decided that it was time for them to do a few things. And by no coincidence, a few things got done. But the Senate's supposed to work every year, not 1 or 2 years out of 15.
Yeah, and this is kind of that issue I mentioned earlier about the view of the Senate as the chamber of no. The unwillingness to basically acknowledge that some action needs to be taken. And granted, the Senate can sometimes have a little bit of a conservative bent towards it in that it is supposed to check the excesses of the House of Representatives. But
Well,
the thing that has struck me about the last last 20 years is that we have really seen a departure from the idea of the Senate as a check on excess and a focus on deliberation and cooperation, and more on a focus of how can I win. And to me, that's speaks to an issue of values, but also a flawed view of strategic interest. Because like you mentioned earlier, all of these politicians are to some extent partisans, but even partisans are supposed to view their interests as partisans through the lens of their public service, their achievements. And so my question, I guess, is how do we get like a figure like McConnell and yet return to that view of deliberation, that view that we are able to deliberate and justify a politician's continuation in the Senate by their service than by their opposition to a given party?
well, I'm going to watch this video again because I thought you put it beautifully. But you're an idealist in a sense, and your view is my view. I actually don't think that the modern senators have, particularly McConnell, have viewed it that way. Basically, they have focused on victory, and to the extent that oftentimes their partisanship has overwhelmed their patriotism. And how you change that? Well, you have to defeat some of these people. You have to defeat Trump initially, uh, although Trump is not the only problem, but you have to defeat Trump and you have to focus on the fact that the Senate Republicans failed catastrophically in their job of legislating in a bipartisan way and also failed to stop Trump's assault on our democracy. So they have to be defeated. Um, Not easy to do, given the red state, blue state divide, and given the number of seats that are up this year. But I try to encourage people, whatever they think about the presidential election, or if they're not totally happy with Biden, Or if they're in the 43 states that are not the seven battleground states, focus on the importance of the Senate. You got to beat somebody. You change the politics of the country if you can beat Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley, red state senators who are two two people who have played a very unconstructive role in our country.
Yeah, and this is where I think what's interesting is we talk about institutional values and who we're looking at, and getting people to pay attention to specific politicians that don't fit with the presidential centric model. And I've worked on several campaigns. I worked on the Raja Krishnamurthy campaign as a volunteer. And then I also worked on the Elizabeth Warren presidential campaign, and then most recently in a primary challenge to Bill Foster with Qasim Rashid. Um, Obviously, we didn't win because Bill Foster is still on the ballot. But one of the things that I distinctly remember experiencing, both in on the congressional side of things, but also even on the presidential side of things, is the attention economy. People not knowing who their member of Congress is, who their senator is, or who even their state representative is, but they'll know who the president is, assuming they aren't still holding on to the 2020 conspiracy theories. Um, so one of the things I think I guess I lead to you is, to what extent can we like actually fix the Senate if the voters are not paying attention enough to who their senators are and what they're doing?
Well, I do think that's a problem. And I look, most people are not as attuned and focused on politics as you or I are all the time. People have lives and jobs and families and a lot of other priorities. But to some extent, and then they tend often to vote for the person on the ballot whose name they might have heard or who's a member of their party. To some extent, though, I put the responsibility on the senators.
Mm,
I blame the senators worse than I think they're more responsible for the breakdown than the voters. The people that have that privilege, extraordinary privilege of being a United States senator, 6 years in the Senate and most often, multiple terms. They owe us more than they're doing.
mm,
They're not, if they wanted to be state legislators, they should have stayed in their state capitals. Nothing wrong with that. And if they wanted to just be partisans, well, then they're misperceiving what they're supposed to do. They're supposed to be partisans who also are focused on the national interest. And I find it, I find it still, and maybe it's an idealized view of the Senate or senators that I had. I find it shocking that so many of them uh, would stand up and have a pep rally for Trump, knowing full well, with absolute certainty, that he's a danger to the country and a danger to our national security and that of our allies. I think they owe us more than that. So I put a lot of it on them.
mm. See, I have two views on that. On the one hand, I definitely agree that it is the responsibility of the people in positions of power, particularly in the Senate, to basically reach out to their constituents. They're supposed to, talk to their constituents, let them know what they're doing. But the other thing I think is particularly pernicious, and I've mentioned this before on other live streams and discussions, is the destruction of local media and really the destruction of even like major outlets like the Washington Post that recently gutted a lot of their staff. And one of the things that I've noticed that is particularly dangerous about that is, with less and less people either working for established or local newspapers that can reach out to specific constituencies, there is also a risk of basically people only looking for the news that they wanna find. And, I'm saying this on a show called The Progressive American, but even my commentary, even my opinion-based journalism depends upon the good faith of established Pulitzer Prize winning newspapers. I remember distinctly that I used to read the Chicago Tribune because it was a nominally conservative newspaper in a progressive state, and then it got gutted, and I would not pay for it because I did not want to give my money to Randall Smith and Alden Global Capital. So if I wouldn't necessarily say this is a challenge to your position, but I do think that to some extent the media bears a level of responsibility in terms of how it's able to conduct itself and maintain itself. And I'm wondering, to what extent does it are the power of the senators actually limited when many of these local newspapers and even national newspapers are increasingly being replaced by partisan rags?
Think there's no question that the changed media since over the last 30 years, let's say, starting with 24/7 cable news, shrill cable on both sides, and then worsening as social media has become the news source for, for many people. And look, the death of local local newspapers is a disaster for the country, in my view. I can't cure all that.
Yeah.
I can't. I mean, you're not asking me to, but I am very worried about that. And I'm worried about a lot of other things. My wife's an educator, and we talk a lot about the education system and the lack of people's knowledge of civics and other things that we grew up with. All of that is true. And that's why that puts even more responsibility on the senators. And, it turns out in 1920, in 2022, 21, 22, they passed an infrastructure bill on a bipartisan basis. They passed the CHIPS and Science bill. They passed the Inflation Reduction Act with ambitious climate policies for the first time. You go down the list, they passed marriage equality to reaffirm marriage equality. You go down the list and you find, yeah, they actually can do the job on occasion. Um, for years, the senators, they've fallen all over themselves, saying all the things they don't like about the Senate. And my challenge to them has always been, well, take back the Senate if you think it's too leader driven or you think it's too partisan. There's 98 of you, and two leaders, and to some extent, some of them have stepped forward in a bipartisan way to do so.
Yeah, and this is kind of where I think it's really important for people to actually know who their senators are and what their positions are, because one of the things that we as constituents are responsible for is not just, just reacting to the senators, but actually understanding the context of their actions and their policy decisions and how they go about pursuing that. Unfortunately, like one of the things I have repeatedly heard is the frustration with Dick Durbin, who's my senator. He, or one of them, about his failure to really act against some of the issues with the runaway Supreme Court, and how a lot of times it has been a waiting game for people to take action when there's clear problems. But to circle back to the idealized view of the Senate, the or rather the most functional Senate, your previous work, the last great Senate, kind of went into detail about how the Senate actually was able to function. And I was wondering if you could do a kind of a distinction between where the last great Senate was and how we where we are now, because we've talked a lot about what's wrong with the Senate. And I think it's important for people to remember, like you mentioned earlier with the CHIPS Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, that the Senate can indeed function. It doesn't always have to be obstructionist.
Well, you're making me happy just calling to mind my first book, The Last Great Senate, which was about the Senate of the 60s and the 70s, but I told the story through the late 70s, which were the closing years of the last great Senate. And it turns out that unfortunately it was an unusual period, that in fact before the 1960s and then again later afterward, the Senate was not as successful. It was a combination of, in the Senate that I wrote about, there was a combination of people who had shared our experience coming out of World War II. The greatest generation doesn't need any more footnotes from me, but that was part of their experience. They had leaders who understood how the Senate should work and instilled a certain model for them. And the senators who came in, people that weren't that old, but a Walter Mondale or a Robert Kennedy and people that came afterward, there was a model there that they sort of gravitated toward. There was a way that the Senate did business. Um, and they held themselves to very high standards. So it's not easy to reproduce that. A lot has changed. But what I tried to say about the long decline, some of it is the parties genuinely moving further apart, makes bipartisan deals harder, genuine differences. Some of it's the change media, as you point out. But there's also, beyond that, it's people, whether it's Newt Gingrich in the House or Mitch McConnell in the Senate, who have led in a pernicious way. Gingrich, the politics of war as war, and McConnell, the politics of obstruction and partisan division. So the decline was gradual until it wasn't gradual and it got sharper in terms of its downward trajectory.
So, and this is kind of where I think one of the things that people like to talk about is like who started it, who was the person who really like almost like a Satan figure, like, oh, who's the one who brought all the people to fall, who's the one who caused all the trouble. And one of the things that I think you've mentioned before, both in your work and in your previous interviews, is it's not so much that there's one person but a collection of failures, particularly when it comes to the view of politics as war when you mentioned Newt Gingrich, but also politics as a matter um, of grievances. For example, one of the things I remember distinctly is Mitch McConnell holding a massive grievance over the failed judicial nomination of Robert Bork, and how he basically felt like this very qualified, in his view, not mine, conservative judge would have been great on the Supreme Court. And I was wondering, to what extent do we have like a continuation of that culture of grievance once McConnell is gone? Because he's leaving after this year.
Well, he's leaving the leadership, yes, and he'll have presumably 2 more years in the Senate. I think it depends on, to large extent, on the presidential election in that sense. I think if Trump is defeated, there's a possibility that the Republicans would have to move to a more back toward a more normal arrangement. The Republicans, I think, the MAGA forces in the Republican Party is very strong at the moment. But if Trump is defeated, that might change. If Trump wins, besides everything else that's in danger, uh, I think he will pick the next Senate leader, and the next Senate leader will be very much of one of his allies, a MAGA Republican. And I think that would be extremely harmful to the Senate. The achievements we talked about in 2022 actually occurred because you had a unified Democratic caucus and then something like a quarter to a third of the Republicans who actually said, oh, this isn't bad. We actually ought to do something rather than just call ourselves senators. And so there's a model for succeeding, but some of those senators who were more moderate have left. And if the MAGA Republicans get a stronger grip in the Republican Party, we'll have a very difficult time in all over Capitol Hill.
Yeah, and I think the other thing, and it kind of goes back to that media issue, is there's also a subsection of not just members of the House, but also like the Senate that are using social media as a mechanism, and like having podcasts like this, where they will actively use their platforms as a way to fundraise. And so there's an incentive structure to almost be like a martyr. Like Ted Cruz has his own podcast. He has all these deals because of it. And I think one of the things that would be deeply concerning is if Trump were to win in the presidential election, if you were to choose somebody with that similar setup, that idea of, sorry, apparently I have an itch or something. I don't know why. But there was I think that there's a very real risk of this kind of self-aggrandizing media environment that rewards attention rather than legislative accomplishment. And one
Oh,
of the things,
absolutely. I
and
mean, there's a lot of performative outrage.
Oh, and the worst thing is, I think it kinda goes back to that what you mentioned earlier about the responsibility of the senators to effectively communicate with their constituents. And unfortunately, what it seems to me is that they're getting their message out, but just in a very, cynical way in some cases, especially with Ted Cruz, because Ted Cruz is notoriously cynical, in the way he, conducts himself. But to go back to Mitch McConnell, and in particular, his relationship with the Trump administration, because everybody wants to talk about the Trump administration, especially with the upcoming election. One of the things that I distinguish January 6th happened. I was actually live when January 6th happened. I was doing a review of the Georgia Senate races. And one of the things that was especially concerning was the fact that we basically had a situation where Mitch McConnell went and said after January 6th that Trump was morally responsible for the events, but really his opposition kind of started to die down to a kind of a whisper. And I was wondering, to what extent do we have to like worry about the Senate getting its backbone back? Because it seems like with certain leadership, it wants to act as
Sure.
an extension of the executive over instead of acting like a co-equal branch of government.
Well, sure. I mean, look, I think that McConnell failed the country. Well, let me go back and say that I was once asked, well, the title of your book is The Betrayal. That's pretty harsh word. I said, well, if you think the senators had the particular responsibility to check a president who threatened the constitutional order, and you think they repeatedly and knowingly failed, that's pretty much of a betrayal. And McConnell, his speeches on January 6th in the morning and February 13th at the second impeachment trial were as eloquent a condemnation of Trump as you could possibly make. And yet, he couldn't vote to convict Trump. I guess he thought, I mean, nobody believes his argument that you couldn't do that to a former president. His calculation was that Trump was still too strong. I think he believed Trump would wither away over time. And he was wrong, basically. He had the last clear chance to do the constitutionally responsible thing. Had he voted to convict Trump, certainly there would have been 9 or 10 others or 15 others who would have joined. And we wouldn't have gone through what we've gone through the last 3 years because Trump would have been disqualified from running for office. Now, is that cowardice or is it just a lack of principle, basically? I mean, Ben Sass, the former senator from Nebraska, who is now a chancellor in Florida of the university there, Ben Sass voted to convict Trump. He said there are some lines you just can't cross. And for McConnell, there's never been that kind of line. Everything basically, there's no principle that's strong enough to uphold. So I don't know whether we call it cowardice or just call it lack of principle.
See, to me, that strikes me as a mix of both. Like, to some
Yeah,
extent, I would look at, like, Mitch McConnell's ability to literally say to the first black president of the United States, "I'm not giving you anything unless you give me what I want," as a sign that he does have backbone. He has the willingness and the power to do things when he wants to. And I think there is a certain extent to where I think you mentioned it in your book that he viewed Trump as early on as his valuable prospect, his challenge to a potentially New Deal Democratic vision. And I think there is a part of him that still is both cowardly and unprincipled, but also opportunistic in that even if Trump didn't wither away, his opposition to Democratic New Deal politics would still remain. At least that would be the kind of calculation that I would suspect he was capable of.
I think that's a really good point. And I try to acknowledge that there's room for legitimate differences between Democrats and Republicans. McConnell would say, and I quote him in the book at different times, when he would oppose the Affordable Care Act, McConnell would say, America's not France. By that means we don't have all this socialized stuff, the government doing everything. I get that. And to some extent, that's a legitimate sort of point of view. But it doesn't justify corrupting the confirmation process the way he did with the Supreme Court justices. When leaders take steps to sort of disregard norms and traditions that have made the institution work, that has very bad consequences. Now, McConnell likes to say, I think you suggested, McConnell has often said, the Democrats are responsible for every escalation of the judicial wars. And that he goes back to Bork, et cetera. He blames them for that. Well, after Bork was defeated with Republican votes as well as Democratic, all the other justices, with the exception of Clarence Thomas, that was a hard hearing, all the other justices were confirmed rather routinely before McConnell discovered that, well, you can't confirm someone in an election year, so we're going to not consider Barack Obama's nomination. He escalated the judicial wars in an unprecedented way. And then he continued doing it, including slamming through the last of the nominations 8 days before Election Day 2020. That kind of trashing of norms, is very consequential for the way the system works and doesn't work.
And that's especially concerning to me because the issue I have with McConnell isn't just that he was an obstructionist and so overtly partisan and really bastardized patriotism. He also sent the message that obstructionism is good for business. If you can uh, portray government as ineffective, as unsuccessful in its endeavors, then nobody will want to ask their government to do anything, and then you perpetuates his worldview. But the other thing that worries me is the potential for a McConnell on the Democratic side. Like there are no angels in government, but there are also risks of escalation into even worse figures. And I was wondering, from the perspective of ensuring that on the Democratic side we don't get a partisan like McConnell, to what extent does the Democratic Party really ready to deal with a potential obstructionist like that within their own ranks?
I must be so partisan. I haven't thought about the problem quite that way. Um, I think the Democrats are certainly imperfect, like any fractious kind of party. But the truth is that they've been able to unite sort of extreme progressives with more moderate Democrats and stay unified with the goal of trying to accomplish some things. I don't accept the view, and you're not saying this, I know, but I don't accept the view that the Democrats and the Republicans are equally to blame for the situation in the country. That's obviously contrary to your view as well.
Absolutely not.
Yeah, so I don't think we're in any real danger of some Democratic uh, obstructionist or demagogue coming along. But I think we're in a very serious situation from a progressive standpoint because many progressives and particularly younger people, not only younger people, but particularly younger people, are disillusioned with Biden for various things. And the worst thing that could possibly happen, I think, is that disillusionment leads them to say, throw up their hands and say, it doesn't matter. We never get anything positive out of these elections anyway, so we'll just sit it out. I think that would be terribly destructive. Um, I understand. I understand their frustrations, and being older. I remember a better time when government worked better. But certainly, Biden has had significant accomplishments, far more consequential presidency than one would have anticipated. And I hope that as we go into the next 5 months, people, if they're disillusioned with him at all, I hope they'll be driven to the polls by their issues, whether it's abortion or climate change or affordable health care or gun control, reducing gun violence. The line between the division between, I'm sorry, the difference between Democrats and Republicans is profound up and down the line.
And on that note, like I want to make clear, and I know you know I wasn't saying this, but there is a
Yeah,
very clear difference between the Democrats and Republicans. If there
yeah.
wasn't, there wouldn't be two political parties. There'd be one. Uh,
No,
People, when it comes to this idea of Democrats and Republicans being the same, particularly on a certain element of the progressive side of the coin, I do think there's a certain feeling of we never see the successes, we never see the discussions, and I do lay that kind of at the feet of the media because they have a negativity bias. They'd much rather cover, a car chase or something like that than go into the minutia of explaining why the CHIPS Act is especially important for the American public going for the next 20, 30 years, because that takes getting people to pay attention longer than a snapshot or a clip. And one of the things that I think is especially important for my audience and other people who may see this going forward is that when you are looking to see change in the political sphere, you can't just vote for one political office. You can't just focus on the presidential side of things. You have to also know who your senators are, who your state reps are, who your congressmen or congresswomen are. It doesn't really those things I think are especially important because otherwise we're going to just have people voting for people like McConnell over and over again, and then it will be like I said earlier, a self-fulfilling prophecy like McConnell wanted. And so I think to kind of
good.
circle back to your previous point of, you know, you remember a time when government worked better. If the Biden administration manages to secure a second term, and I personally think he will, um, it'll be close, but I think he will. To what extent does the president bear responsibility for how he conducts himself with a likely opposition Senate, as Senate it looks like the Republicans are poised to take it?
Well, I don't think they're necessarily going to take it, basically. Virtually every Democratic incumbent who presumably is endangered, is actually running well ahead of Biden and likely to get reelected. Obviously, the majority hangs by a thread,
Yeah.
and there are seats that are up. But look, I think certainly the president, if reelected, bears the responsibility of communicating his achievements and the things that he's aspiring to do. Um, I think he's tried to do that. I think he has to do more of it, and he will do more of it. I think, people sort of say, well, Biden's not communicating what he did enough. Well, he's also trying to provide some leadership on two wars at the same time. To some extent, and they do it, but to some extent, we need senators, congressmen and popular governors and mayors to pick up the responsibility as well. People in Pennsylvania who admire Josh Shapiro, the people in Michigan who support Gretchen Whitmer, governors need to take the lead and talk about not only their states, but what the federal government and Biden is doing for them.
Well, on that note, I want to thank you very much for coming because I think that's been a really important thing that we need to talk about again and again, that it's not just the presidency that matters as much as the media loves to focus on it. Um, but I would again like to say you're more than welcome to come back on the show. If there's any closing statements, feel free to go for it.
No, look, Connor, I really appreciate the chance to be with you. And it's wonderful that you've been doing this for several years. Uh, I think the degree to which we have voices like yours and using the media this way in a way to try to bring the issues and educate people about the issues is really terrific. I'd love to come back at some point, and I really am grateful that you gave me the chance to be with you.
Thank you very much. Everybody, the book is The Betrayal: How Mitch McConnell and the Senate Republicans Abandoned America. You can find it on your in your local bookstore or on Amazon. Thank you very much, everybody, and have a wonderful day.